Black Friday is over, so the only discounts you are going to get today are these last minute waiver wire additions. Here are the players that you can add off of the waiver wire to help you guys bring home a victory going into week 13 last minute. Let's kick the video off with Devon Vele of the Denver Broncos, currently sitting at 37% rostered. He has 10 or more fantasy points in 3 straight games, coming off of his best fantasy performance of the season in week 12 against the Raiders with 14 fantasy points. And here in week 13 at home to wrap up the week, the final game of the week on Cyber Monday, or last holiday of the week, right? We have got the Broncos facing the Cleveland Browns, a smash matchup. The Browns in the bottom 10 against the wide receiver position in terms of fantasy points allowed. So this is a fantastic spot for Vele. He has moved up slightly in roster percentage. Not a crazy amount. I know we got no teams on bye week, so don't know how many guys really need to go out and make a move, but I actually just think for the remainder of the fantasy season, Devon Vele should be rostered because this Denver Broncos passing attack continues to make strides with Bo Nix at the quarterback position, and we've just been waiting for somebody to step up on a consistent basis behind Courtland Sutton. We've seen some flashes from Marvin Mims and Troy Franklin and even Lil Jordan Humphrey, but I think the most consistent potential player that we could get at wide receiver on the Broncos behind Courtland Sutton is Devon Vele. I know that the Broncos have that inconvenient bye in week 14, but they have a good matchup in week 15 against the Colts, and then a good matchup in week 17 against the Bengals, the Chargers in the middle there in week 16. So if Vele is out there, I could see him being a potential flex option for the remainder of the season. But if you need a last-minute play here in week 13, whether you're looking at the wide receiver spot or a flex spot, Devon Vele against the Browns, a fantastic ad. He sits at just 37% rostered. And I've been saying this all week long. I love Devon Vele's current line on Underdog for his receiving yards, sitting at 32.5 total receiving yards. He has hit that in 3 straight games, and this is another smash matchup in week 13 against the Cleveland Browns. So I'm heading straight to Underdog, taking the over on Vele's total receiving yards. All new users who sign up on Underdog with promo code TheCatch, that link is down below, are getting a free NFL Pick Em to use towards week 13. Take your free Pick Em, take the over on Vele's receiving yards. Once both of those lines hit, you're going to automatically triple your cash entry. And on top of that, when you guys sign up on Underdog with promo code TheCatch, Underdog is also going to give you a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. So that's a free NFL Pick'em to use towards Week 13's action, and up to $1,000 in bonus cash on Underdog when you sign up with promo code TheCatch. That link is down below. Next up, we got Marquez Valdes-Scantling coming off of his bye week in week 12. He gets the Rams here in week 13, a fantastic matchup for him. He's had 16 or more fantasy points in his last 2 starts. Low volume games, but 3 touchdowns in those last 2 starts with a ceiling of 25.9 fantasy points. And like I said, a fantastic matchup this weekend against the LA Rams at home. And once again, somebody let me know who are the other wide receivers on this team. I mean, Mason Tipton didn't even play in week 11. He was a healthy scratch. Cedric Wilson was also a healthy scratch. Like, I literally don't know who else played wide receiver for the Saints in week 11. I'm not going to lie to you. I know that Taysom Hill had a very good game. I know that Alvin Kamara is going to get his production. I know that MVS had a good game. But seriously, who are the pass catchers here? But Jawan Johnson at tight end? Who are the other wide receivers on the Saints? I mean, I could look it up, but literally it's MVS and that's it. And anytime you have a wide receiver 1 on any team, regardless of the offensive situation, they are worth something in fantasy. It's a great matchup against the Rams this week. Even if he sees a low volume game, he could still have a large impact like we saw in weeks 10 and weeks 11. Those were good matchups as well. Good matchup here in week 13 against the Rams, and this is another player that I could see for the remainder of the fantasy season having value. Not as strong of a strength of schedule here as he gets the Giants, Commanders, Packers, and Raiders to wrap up. But once again, who else is catching the football for the Saints outside of Kamara and the tight ends on this team? I don't think Olave is coming back this season. We'll see if that changes. but there's really nobody else here. So if MVS is out there, he's certainly worth adding, potentially for the long term, but most importantly, here in week 13 in a good matchup at home against the Rams. And next up, we got Nick Westbrook-Ikini, a player who we've talked about a lot over the past couple weeks. He has a touchdown in every game since week 6 of the season, except for week 10 against the Chargers. He's had 12.8 or more fantasy points in 2 straight games. He's had double-digit fantasy points in 4 of his last 5 games. Nick Westbrook-Ikini sits at 27% rostered. He just feels like this player that nobody wants to add, nobody wants to take a shot on. I know the volume has been kind of low for Nick Westbrook-Ikini as well. I mean, he only has more than 3 catches in 1 game since week 6, but he's produced on a consistent basis in every game since week 6, except for week 10. He either has a double-digit performance or a touchdown. And this offense has looked better over the past 2 weeks in terms of their passing game. Will Levis has looked better over the past 2 weeks, 3 weeks as well. So if Westbrook-Ikini's out there, it's not the greatest matchup, not the worst matchup against the Commanders this week, but it's good enough that you can play him. And then you look at the strength of schedule for the rest of the season. The Titans have one of the best overall schedules for the remainder of the season and through the fantasy playoffs. They're going to get Jacksonville, Cincinnati, Indianapolis. Then they wrap up in the fantasy championship with Jacksonville again. So Nick Westbrook-Ikini is a player that's going to have an impact for the remainder of the season, a player that you can throw in at the flex. And maybe there's not a ton of upside here, but the floor is there due to the touchdown upside. And these are the type of matchups where he can easily come through with touchdowns. I feel like it sounds crazy, but he might be a true league winner, a player who just comes through with those floors, but against some of these teams like Jacksonville and Cincinnati, might end up with stat lines that help push you over to victory in those respective weeks. So if Westbrook-Ikini is out there, he's definitely playable this week on the road against Washington. For the remainder of the season, he could end up being a strong flex option as well. Next up, let's talk about Adam Thielen of the Carolina Panthers, coming in at 48% roster. In his first game since injury, he came through with 8.7 fantasy points. Not the best here, 4 targets, 3 catches, 57 receiving yards, but he did look involved in the offense there. And it was a tough matchup against the Chiefs, first game back, all that stuff. But the important thing to pay attention to here is that the Panthers offense continues to make some strides with Bryce Young at quarterback, showing out some impressive overall. I mean, even though they're not getting victories here, some impressive performances compared to what we saw early in the season. And this is a great matchup for Thielen and company in week 13 against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And once again, here you've got a pretty strong strength of schedule to wrap up. Tampa Bay, Philly, not so good. Dallas, good enough. Arizona, good enough. Then Tampa Bay again. I mean, Tampa Bay twice, just that period makes it a good strength of schedule for the rest of the season, right? And one thing I will mention, while I'm talking about Adam Thielen, right, you still got Xavier Leggett sitting at 47% rostered. And then this past week, David Moore kind of came out of nowhere with 20 fantasy points. He sits at 9% rostered. I do think that Xavier Leggett could continue to be a player with some production. He has 9.6 or more fantasy points in 3 of his last 4 matchups. And maybe David Moore continues to see some production, but I don't really want to chase the points from week 12 because he's done nothing else on the rest of the season. But the reason I want to take a shot on Adam Thielen is because him and Bryce Young had that really strong chemistry last year. Thinking some of that can bleed over into this season. Listen, like I said, the Panthers have made a lot of strides. Bryce Young's playing much better football, but this is obviously still not the most prolific offense in the league by any stretch. But in some of these soft matchups, these wide receivers are going to come through. I mean, somebody's got to come through here, right? So might see a little bit of inconsistency here. Might see Leggett at times, maybe more at times. But I think Thielen could end up being the most consistent player here. And in some of these soft matchups, like the one we're getting in week 13, Adam Thielen is certainly worth a waiver addition. All right, and we do have one situation at running back that's going to open up a spot play or a potential spot play going into week 13, and that is J.K. Dobbins, who suffered that knee injury against his former team in week 12. But what exactly do we do here? We got a bit of a committee situation is what I think is going to happen. I still think Gus Edwards will get the most touches, kind of be that like 3-down back, get some goal line work, but Hassan Haskins is also probably going to get some goal line work, and Kamani Vidal, the rookie, is also returned here from injury, so he might have a role again as well. But I would say if you can pick up Gus Bus, you can definitely start him. I think he's startable this week, but it's not a fantastic matchup on the road against the Atlanta Falcons, who have been pretty stout against running backs on the season. Then we look forward, like how long is Dobbins going to be out here? If he's out in week 14, it's another tough matchup against the Kansas City Chiefs. And by the time a good matchup rolls around in week 15, Dobbins should be back. This isn't expected to be a long-term injury, but you never know. So for that reason, I think Gus Edwards is worth picking up because he will see the most volume, is my guess. But who knows what Harbaugh wants to do here? We're probably going to see some Haskins at the goal line, and we're probably going to see some sort of involvement out of Kamani Vidal. But the Chargers running back that I would take the biggest shot on is Gus Edwards. But here in week 13, no bye weeks. Like, do you really need to start Gus Edwards? I hope not. But he might be an option. Kamani Vidal at 17% might be an option as well. But I just don't know if I'm going to go out there and stash Vidal. Like at that point, I think we might as well stash Haskins. Like we had some hope in Vidal early in the season after the kind of big game with that big touchdown reception in week 6 against Denver. Then he did next to nothing the following weeks. Then he got placed on injured reserve for a couple weeks. So, you know, for me, I would try to avoid this situation. But if I'm going to pick up one Chargers running back for a spot play in week 13 out of desperation, it is Gus Edwards. All right, and outside of that, there is really nothing at the running back position that you guys can take a shot on. Amir Abdullah and the Raiders already played yesterday, so there's really nothing out there in terms of running backs that you can pick up and hope for in terms of spot plays. So here are your handcuff running backs as we start to wrap up the fantasy season that you guys can take a look at, see if you want to try and handcuff one of your starting running backs or try and handcuff one of your opponent's running backs in case those running backs get hurt. But if I'm going to take a shot on anyone here, well, I do think there's plenty of options, and these aren't the only options. Guys like Jalen Warren, Justice Hill at least give you some standalone value. Then in terms of stronger handcuffs, Ray Davis, Jordan Mason, guys that we've seen perform as RB1s on the season so far. Those would be my main additions at the position because I think they give you the most standalone value or the best potential in terms of RB1 value. But hey, this could go in any direction. And like I said, these aren't the only handcuff running backs, but here are some of them and their current roster percentages. All right, and very quickly, we already went over our streaming quarterbacks and tight ends in one of Friday's videos, but I'll go through what we got here again for you guys. Let's start at the quarterback position and let's take a look at Russell Wilson. I know he's been disappointing in the past 2 weeks with 13.8 or less fantasy points in 2 straight games, which leaves him at 42% rostered. But I think this is a good enough matchup against the Cincinnati Bengals, who are allowing for a lot of total yards, passing touchdowns, the 29th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks, that if you're desperate, you need to roll with a streaming option at quarterback, you can definitely consider Russell Wilson this week. We've also talked a lot about Will Levis as of late, who will get the Washington Commanders, who come in 19th against quarterbacks. He sits at 18% rostered with 16 or more fantasy points in 3 straight games. He should be able to provide a floor if there's nothing better for you. Maybe you're in a double quarterback superflex format. I think Will Levis is startable in those formats moving forward. We talked about this earlier, but the strength of schedule for the Tennessee Titans to wrap up the season is very strong. Washington, Jacksonville, Cincy, Indianapolis, and Jacksonville again. Will Levis is going to have some solid games to wrap up the season. Call me crazy. I know he's still turning the football over a bit, doing some Will Levis stuff, but like I said, he gives you a decent floor in fantasy. He's got a very strong strength of schedule, very lowly rostered as well. Then we got Bryce Young, who, like I said earlier in the video, you know, the Panthers are playing better offensive football. Bryce Young is playing better overall. He sits at just 12% rostered. I'm still not ready to like start Bryce Young in fantasy, but if you're desperate for a streaming option at quarterback this week, he gets the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. They're allowing the 31st most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. So this is the time. If you want to spot play Bryce Young, this is the week to do it. I probably wouldn't do it any other week for the remainder of the season outside of when they play Tampa Bay again in week 17. But Bryce Young is an option, but just bear in mind, even in these better starts, like we haven't seen more than 16 fantasy points out of Bryce Young, and that's only in one game against Kansas City. Every other game, 15 or less fantasy points. So I would just take the matchup if you're desperate and don't hope for anything more there. Now, Last quarterback here is Matthew Stafford, who does sit at 60% rostered. But we look at what Stafford's done since week 8, right? He's had 18 or more fantasy points in every game except for week 10 against Miami, 2 or more passing touchdowns in every game since week 8. Except for week 10 against Miami, and he gets a pretty decent matchup against the Saints, giving up the 17th most fantasy points to the quarterback position. Plus, we're going to see Stafford and the Rams and a lot of competitive game scripts as they're trying to sneak into the playoffs and come away with as many victories as they possibly can over the next couple of weeks before they have those last 3 divisional games between weeks 15 and 18 against San Fran, Arizona, and Seattle. So Stafford definitely very startable, even in single quarterback leagues, but a little bit higher roster than a couple tight ends if you're desperate. I still think Will Dissly is an option. He sits at 47% rostered. A little disappointing in week 12. We expected maybe a little bit more, but he still has 8 or more fantasy points in every game since week 7, except for week 9 against Cleveland. So he has somewhat of a floor, a pretty decent amount of upside, and a good matchup this week against the Falcons, allowing the 19th most fantasy points to tight ends. And Quentin Johnston, very underwhelming this past week. Josh Palmer still hasn't done a whole lot. We know Ladd McConkey's the wide receiver 1 there, so maybe Dissly continues to see more increased volume, especially with J.K. Dobbins hurt. We'll find out. Hunter Henry just kind of lives in that streaming category. The Colts are giving up the 26 most fantasy points to tight ends. Henry is 53% rostered. He has 9.4 or more fantasy points in every game since week 6, except for a tough matchup in week 10 against the Chicago Bears. He's one of Drake May's favorite targets, one of the most consistent targets for Drake May as a wide receiver positions all over the place for the Patriots. So if you need a spot play, he probably brings you a very safe floor, around 10 fantasy points. And he's got a great matchup as the Colts have really struggled against tight ends on the season. And then last but not least, your tried and true streaming option is Pat Freiermuth, who sits at 43% rostered. You know you're going to get some sort of points out of Freiermuth. The ceiling isn't incredibly high, but similar to Russell Wilson this week, he gets a great opportunity against the Cincinnati Bengals, who are allowing the 30th most fantasy points to the tight end position. So this could be one of the weeks where Freiermuth has a higher ceiling. We've seen 9.9 or more fantasy points in 2 out of his last 3 matchups. Yes, he's been inconsistent. Yes, the ceiling hasn't been super high, but the matchup is there. And you know that Freiermuth will at least get you something if you're truly desperate at tight end here in week 13. That'll do it for today's video. There are your last minute waiver wire additions heading in to week 13 of the fantasy season. Don't forget, guys, I'm answering all fantasy football questions in the comment section down below. So if you guys need anything whatsoever, be sure to drop me a comment. I'll get back to you guys as soon as I possibly can. But more importantly, make sure you guys are subscribed to the channel, because we're going to have everything you could possibly need on a weekly basis to help you guys dominate the rest of 2024 fantasy football. So make sure that you guys are subscribed so that you don't miss out on any of the content. With that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.